I think that seems a lot more like hopeful and collective rather than an apocalyptic story in the way that you've been talking about this, Adam, which is perhaps more about just like trying to not die, whether that means like individually or, you know, you have your collective interests too, but it's a little easier to forget about the collective responsibility than when time is the centerpiece.
You are listening to the Down the Wormhole podcast, exploring the strange and fascinating relationship between science and religion. This week, our hosts are...
I'm Zack Jackson, UCC pastor in Reading, Pennsylvania, and since tomorrow is Ian's birthday, we're going to say our favorite things about Ian. And since this is just a short introduction and we can't go on for the entire hour, we'll only just say one apiece, because we really could. So I'm going to say that one of my favorite things about Ian is his endless enthusiasm for life and new ventures.
Rachel Jackson, rabbi at Agudas Israel congregation.
I mean, it's literally the reason why this podcast exists. So
Thank you.
I was going to say probably the same thing, but using different words in a succinct fashion. Insatiable curiosity is the thing that I like the most about Ian.
I'm going to go because I'm sure I'll probably bring the timbre of things down. So
I would expect nothing less.
there we go. Right. So my name is Adam Pryor. I teach at Bethany College in Lindsborg, Kansas. I think the thing that I appreciate most about Ian is he is the only person who's not a family member that texts me. So when my phone beeps, Rachel goes, "Is it Ian?" And I say, "Yep."
It's not like I do it that often,
It's adorable.
but I do. I have to check in, you buddy. It's like academic to
Hey,
academic.
it's good. I'm glad someone checks in on me. I mean, in all likelihood, I'll probably be found dead in my office one day, so it's good to have someone check in on
with
me.
all these texts from me.
That's right.
I'm Kendra Holt-Moore, PhD student at Boston University, and I also really appreciate Ian's enthusiasm, but I will add on a particular instance in which that is greatly appreciated, which is his responsiveness to emails and text messages that I forget to respond to, and then I don't have to feel bad once I know at least somebody has responded.
it's the Post-it notes. That's how he does it.
That's right. You've seen him. Ian Benz, Associate Professor of Elementary Science Education at UNC Charlotte. And my favorite thing about me is right now, I'd say my family. I'm watching them run around, and my son is in the background holding up cute signs for me saying, "Go daddy, down the wormhole." And now just put them onto his sword, and I need to take a picture. We definitely have to share that with the audience. It's very cute.
Sweet.
So, yes, that's my favorite thing right now. Okay, so now I'm going to go cry
Happy
for a little
birthday.
bit, and I'll be right back. Thank you.
Well, I'm
I love you
glad
guys.
that we started on a high note, because I have a feeling that the general tenor of this conversation may take some downward turns. Though I gotta say, so I understand that we are in the midst of a global pandemic, the likes of which have not been seen, perhaps ever, in terms of its length and breadth. So we will not just be talking doom and gloom today, because nobody is picking up a podcast today and saying, you know what, I need a break from all the news on social media and on the news about all of this horrible things. I'm going to listen to a fun podcast about a movie that I love, and I'm going to listen to them talk for an hour about the end of the world. So we're not going to do that.
I won't let you.
As much as I would
I won't
love
let
to,
us. Yeah.
because eschatology is totally my jam, which is a fancy theological way of saying the end of things, the study of the end. There's two Greek words for the end, eschaton and telos. Eschaton meaning just the literal end, Telos meaning more of a completion. The end of a story, when things end with a purpose. Eschaton is just the end, so there's not any inherent meaning in that. We add meaning to it, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Because so I am fascinated by the ways in which cultures talk about cataclysm. Man, I don't know how I'm going to make this peppy. The end
Just with your
of
with
the
your
world.
with your enthusiasm about talking.
Yes,
about it.
with my
Yes.
And Ian's
Jeff-
curiosity. And
Jeff once said that I had boundless energy and enthusiasm.
Yeah.
that's right.
Peppy background music. I love it.
Yeah, we're going to go for the peppiest of background music, because this is going to come out on the 15th. At least it would have if I hadn't messed up the release schedule. I mean, sorry to interrupt you, Zack, from the past, as you were. Which is, in the Christian world, a few days after Easter, when we're all talking about new life and resurrection. So we're going to bring it back around to some of that too, because in all of the stories that I'm really interested in, when we're talking about final cataclysms, there's almost always, and maybe with very few exceptions, stories they end with some kind of a hope for something new and good and better. And for thousands of years, we have told these stories when things have seemed like they're at the worst. When you look around and you say that children aren't respecting their parents anymore, there's just wanton disregard for elders and sexual immorality left and right. It's the same. Oh, and corrupt politics. It's the same exact thing in almost every ancient text when they're talking about what the end of the world is going to be like. It's just like kids are bad and there's sex all over the place and it's no good and bad, and so God's going to destroy the thing. Like that's almost the preface to every single apocalypse in the ancient world, which is comforting because everyone thinks that they're unique and everyone thinks that their end is the end. But it hasn't been yet. And so in all of these old apocalypses, these end time stories, things get as bad as they could possibly get before they end, and then there's some happy conclusion to it. And that's really overgeneralizing, and I'll get into some specifics later. But we've always done that in the context of religion, of our common stories, our mythologies. There's always been heavenly battles and wars and cosmic comeuppance. But now we're in an age of ever increasing secularity. Is that a word? Secularness?
Secularism?
Secularosity.
No, I don't like the isms.
Yeah. Well, what I mean to say is we're less concerned about stories about God and spirits and beings, and we're more interested in things that we can touch and feel and see and measure. And so how have then our stories changed and evolved? And I think that Interstellar is a stellar example of how we do this creative storytelling without relying on deities. And in some cases, you might argue that it kind of does. And most of these generally tend to as well. But through this modern form of sci-fi, we're finding new ways of exploring humanity's lowest and the hope we might find to get out of it. And so we could spend several miniseries talking about the movie Interstellar and its science behind it. And I would encourage everyone who can to check out Kip Thorne's book that he wrote as a companion to this movie, because it is really interesting. And so the backup, for those of you who don't know, this movie was a kind of passion project for the Nolan brothers, Christopher and Jonathan. Am I getting that right? Yes, Christopher and Jonathan, where they were working on an idea for some time, and kind of at the same time, there were other people working on similar ideas, and their stories kind of converged. And Kip Thorne, who's a theoretical physicist, was brought on as the science advisor, scientific consultant, and executive producer. And from the very beginning, they had a strict set of rules. And he says that first, nothing in the movie can violate established physical laws. So at one point, he had this argument with Christopher Nolan for weeks when Christopher Nolan was trying to make one of the characters travel faster than light. And he says, no, look, we can get around this with time and space dilation and wormholes and all of that, but we cannot travel faster than light. That is a law of the universe. And I will not bend on this. And second, that all the wild speculations that may come out of this would spring from science and not from the, quote, fertile mind of a screenwriter. So in the book, he breaks it down into these categories of things that are scientific fact, things that are scientifically plausible, but unproven, and then things that are wild speculation but are still based on science. And the amount of work and consultations that were done in this movie is just amazing. Just the black hole, gargantua in this movie, individual frames of this took 100 hours apiece to render.
That's unbelievable.
The amount of physics that went into creating the visual of that black hole spawned something like 3 different papers about black holes. Throughout the movie, you'll see all of these equations written all over chalkboards that they're trying to figure out. They're trying to figure out how to harness gravitational anomalies to send this enormous spacecraft hurtling out of the atmosphere and through this wormhole that's been placed there mysteriously. And they can't figure it out. And all of those equations that are all over the boards are his equations that were in working out the science, the physics behind all of this. So if we wanted to, we could spend weeks just breaking down the science of this movie because it is rich and wonderful and beautiful. And so I would instead invite you to read that book during quarantine, or the audiobook. That's how I read it.
And I will also add that, if the entire book is not possible, there's a lovely article which will be in our show notes where Neil deGrasse Tyson actually goes over the science in there and talks a lot about those particular pieces, but in his usual digestible way. Like I said, there will be
I didn't know that. Okay.
So
that article
confession.
myself.
Confession. I have not seen the movie Interstellar. And so in preparation for today's conversation, I have just read about the movie and I have read things talking about the movie. So please, listeners, take that with a grain of salt for anything that I might say. But yeah, that's why I've looked up a whole lot of articles on the plot and the science and all that jazz. But I might get some actual plot points incorrect, so I will stay quiet.
It's also a nearly 3-hour movie, and so if we want to talk about plot points, we're going to be just doing that. But the basis of the movie, for those of you who are unfamiliar, maybe you saw it a long time ago, is that the world is falling apart. And the particular way that the apocalypse, the end of humanity is coming, is through blight. Which, when I first watched the movie, I didn't pick up on. Did anybody else pick up on that, or did you think it was a global warming situation?
I thought they were connected.
Yeah, I thought they were connected too.
He makes it pretty clear in the book that they're not.
Huh. Oh,
I've not read any of the book.
It's just because it's in our cultural milieu that climate change is going to ruin everything, that whenever we see a post-apocalyptic world now where crops are failing, we just assume that it's because of climate change. But they wanted to do something that wasn't climate change related.
Oh, so you're telling me that I got to read something now?
You can listen to it.
I mean, we're talking about movies.
I mean, what else are you doing?
I don't know.
Writing your own book, maybe?
Yeah, I'm trying to again.
So the oxygen's being depleted, that they're living in a kind of post-truth world where people doubt the moon landing, and
Oh yes.
and there's all these weird gravitational anomalies that lead them down this path to this secret NASA base where they're trying to save humanity, get them off of Earth, because a wormhole has opened up next to Saturn, right?
Saturn.
Yep.
And they've seen through the wormhole that there are a number of potentially habitable planets that are revolving around this slowly rotating black hole. And they've sent scouting missions through, and a few of them have come back looking promising, but it's so hard to say because of the time dilation and because of the distortion that comes through the wormhole. They can't know unless they go there. So that is kind of what sets up the rest of the movie. And since Rachel hasn't seen it, then I won't spoil any of the major
Feel free to spoil.
Because
Feel free to spoil because I've read everything about it. So. I read things that said spoiler alert, and I went, keep reading. So I'm fine with spoilers.
All right,
and the movie came out in 2014, so I think we feel generally comfortable to make those spoilers because it's not new. My child was born in 2014, so I haven't seen any movies since then.
And
that were Disney.
he's not new.
No,
no offense to your child. Your child is beautiful.
So in this movie, there is a scientist played by Michael Caine, Professor Brand, and he is trying to work out the physics behind harnessing these gravitational anomalies to send massive spacecrafts out of Earth's orbit and through that wormhole and into one of those habitable planets, because they're convinced that wormhole was opened up by some other transdimensional being to save us. And so we need to take advantage of it while we can. And right there you have this otherworldly salvation, the Deus Ex Machina that is coming down to save humanity. But we have to be the ones to figure out the mechanics of it. Like, it's not just given to humanity. It's not just a white horse that comes down. We have to be the ones to do that. And they use science to do that, which is not obviously not something that shows up in the ancient stories of the end of the world. It's always that humanity is kind of helpless when we reach our end. And I'm wondering if there's something in that in our scientific culture, if we are not feeling more empowered by science than pre-scientific people did by religion.
Ask that again.
Well, so it's something that I've seen in other science fiction as well, that science gives people the tools to do it themselves, to solve the problems. And even we talked about Contact, where the aliens sent the plans, but we still had to decode it and make the thing. And
well, the rich billionaire did.
Oh, of course, because America.
Yeah.
Right. But do you think that science has generally given people more of a feeling of personal agency in solving the problems of the world than religion has, or am I misreading that?
I think it's hard to answer that question, yes or no, because, like, if you're talking about a moment in time and whether science was more empowering or not, for some people, yes. But I think even if you are scientifically inclined, and sure, science, the development of science have been like critically empowering in all sorts of ways, it also is a driver of curiosity. And I think there's also a part in which the more you know, the more confused you are, and the more that you realize that you don't know. So it is empowering and also frustrating because I think it makes you realize how small you are. But I think the other side of that question that I'm thinking of is just that while there are people who will be empowered by scientific knowledge, there are, I think, always going to be a portion of people who still find their ultimate rest or ultimate comfort in their religiosity. And I don't think it's like either or. I think people, as we've talked a lot about, I think on this podcast, people who like live or dip their toes in both of those realms. And I think that religion and science provide different kinds of comfort. And it's just such a weird, like interconnected web of like thoughts that people use to like provide meaning for themselves, that it's really hard to separate out those two things and say this is empowering and this is not. So yeah, I think that's probably how I feel about it.
Well, and I'll confess some of my bias coming at this from somebody who was raised on the Left Behind series, which we talked about before, and the kind of the end is coming and God will make everything right. So we don't necessarily need to worry as much about fixing everything and doing it ourselves, because the book of Revelation is super fiery and it all gets burned up. And there's a lot of weird stuff happening, but it all gets burned up and God has to come in and do everything. So it's almost like God invites you to help recreate the world in this beautiful, wonderful way. But in the end, you're always going to come short. So God's going to have to come in and shake the Etch-a-Sketch and start over again. And so I never really felt completely empowered through that particular Christian eschatology to actually do anything, to feel that I had that much control over the future of humanity.
Yeah, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, and yet there are people who I think would take that same set of like cultural tools of like the Left Behind series and interpretations of like humans being ultimately helpless and in the hands of God. That I think is also really comforting and empowering for some people. Like, oh, I can't do anything to fix this terrible situation, so I just have to trust God. And while for some people that clearly seems like not empowering whatsoever, to others it's like, yeah, I don't have to be worried because it's like out of my control, and that's almost a relief. And I think you actually can have both of those interpretations in Interstellar. Interestingly.
Way to bring it back around to the movie. But I was going to jump in before that, bringing it back around. So I've been listening to this, and I don't have that cultural understanding that you have, Zach, nor do I have the religious understanding from that. So when you ask the question, my answer starts similar to Kendra's, and then I think it really depends on the specific time and place that you're thinking of. And for Judaism, I really divide it into 3, 4-ish big chunks. The biblical Judaism, which if you really want to say biblical Judaism, call it the first 2,000 years prior to rabbinic Judaism. So 1800 BCE, give or take, is the start of biblical Judaism, up until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, which was really the start of rabbinic Judaism as a thing rather than just an offshoot. And then rabbinic Judaism for about 1,500 years. And then the last 500 years, you could either keep as 500-600 years, keep as its own thing, or split that also for the last couple hundred years with the Enlightenment and the general feeling from the French Revolution of every person is equal and brotherhood and all that jazz, which includes Jews then. And so what do we do about them? as a total parenthetical aside, this is how my mind works. Every time I say that, I always hear the song from Sound of Music, "How do you solve a problem like Maria?" But it's "How do you solve a problem like the Jews?" Because that's kind of been that's kind of how the external world has viewed us for a very, very long time. Like, how do you solve the
Neat.
problem of the Jews? And there's lots written about that. But that's for a different
For
day.
the record, I don't see the Jews as a problem.
Well, thank you.
Just gonna
Nor do
go ahead
I.
and put that out there.
But thank you. So when you're talking about this, I'm going back to early rabbinic Judaism, first millennia. And I'm looking at that, and I'm reminded of a couple of stories. And I think I might have shared one of these before, but it's basically the idea. Rabbi Hillel says, "You are not required to finish the work, neither are you free to desist from it." And then another idea in that same vein is, if you are in the middle of planting a seedling and the Messiah comes, you finish planting the seedling and then greet the Messiah.
Huh.
Because
You're going to have to unpack that one a little bit.
Because the idea that was really established in early rabbinic Judaism is that we do have the control. We do have the ability to fix this world. There is not going to be a fiery end. There's not going to be another global flood like there was in Noah. That was the whole point of the covenant. And the whole point of the covenant that was given to Abraham, again, this is rabbinic interpretation of biblical texts, was that we've got this, that God's going to be with us and we're going to mess up and it's okay. But the world that we look at is a partnership, right? That's really what a covenant means. A covenant is a relationship contract. And that means we are here to help repair the world. Our job is to see a problem and make it better. And if you're planting a tree, that means you're making the world better. Because, of course, it's going to be a carob tree, and carob trees, it takes 70 years for it to fruit, which means that you have the hope that there is going to be 70 years worth and somebody is going to be there 70 years later, right? This is the carob tree and the honey story. And the question is, well, why are you planting this tree? Well, they were here when I was here. So why wouldn't I? Somebody planted this for me. I'm going to plant this for somebody else, even if I myself will not reap the benefits. So all those stories tied in together. And so if you're in the action of making the world right, of bringing justice, bringing mercy, bringing tzedakah. Tzedakah is often translated as charity, but it's really obligatory compassion, expressed in a tangible financial or goods kind of way. And if in that time the Messiah then comes and says, "Hey, what's going on?" You're like, "Let me finish doing my part. Then you can take over." Because we're never exactly sure, but what we are sure of are our own actions. And that's what we have the most control over.
That's so interesting to me, because what I'm most familiar with is Second Temple apocalypticism. So pre-rabbinical, but post-biblical, like this period of during Greek occupation and the Hasmonean period, and the period in between the Hebrew scriptures and Jesus, where there's this flourishing of literature that all kind of sound like the end of Daniel, about various ways that the world is going to end, and that the Son of Man shall return and the Messiah will come, and everything there'll be punishment and judgment, and this is kind of the world that Jesus comes out of. And Christianity is very much an apocalyptic religion early on. They all expected that the end was coming. I mean, even Jesus, after he gave his little apocalypse, says, "Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here today who will not taste death before seeing the Son of Man coming in his glory." And, the early church took him at his word and really thought that he was coming next Tuesday. And we're very confused when he didn't, because Christianity wasn't set up to be a long-term religion. It was set up to be an apocalyptic religion about the end. And it seems that after the destruction of the temple and the scattering of all Jewish people and Christians for that time period before Constantine, we kind of all had to figure out what the world looks like when the apocalypse happened and then God didn't come back. Right? Jerusalem being destroyed is the apocalypse. It's the end. That's the end of the world as far as Jews and Christians are concerned at that time period, right? And what do you do after that when you have to settle in and figure out how to live now?
So are we on like bonus time now?
Yes.
Bonus level.
That is what should be taken away from that. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, bonus. Okay.
Bonus time. But it's like in soccer when you don't know how long you have left in the time, because there's no timer and the ref just goes, all right, you're done now.
Yeah.
We rarely do sports analogies. I have to look that one up.
I don't really watch soccer, but I watched it once and it was very confusing. Can I just say, by the way, that maybe my favorite apocalypse from this time period is in 4th Ezra, where all of creation is destroyed, but then it gets to take a nap for a week before the new one is created. 7 days returning to primeval silence before being resurrected into the new creation. And most of them just go straight from destruction to new creation and nobody gets a break. And so I really like the fact that we get to have a week off.
Well, I'm going to have to look, going back to Kendra's point, I'm going to have to watch this movie eventually. And see which view, because I was reading like that sounds like a very dystopian perspective, but I don't know. Is it that dire?
Yeah. I'd say that there are definitely parts that are pretty dire.
Okay.
I think it's hopeful overall, though.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
It ends very hopeful.
Okay.
Well, so it comes out midway through the movie that Professor Brand had been lying about Plan A.
Everybody.
Plan A was to create this gravitational well to then send people off and save them. That was Plan A. Plan B was to send a bunch of embryos off to another planet to restart humanity and have kind of a primordial Adam and Eve there to raise everyone. And he always thought Plan B was the only one, but he lied to people saying that Plan A was possible in order to give them hope. And so that's the part of the movie where it's like, all right, there's no hope. This is all for naught. And we've got this random Matt Damon spotting because we all have to be saving Matt Damon in every movie ever.
Every movie.
Yep.
Every movie ever. He's so helpless.
He's definitely helpless in this one.
But you get a lot of the selfishness of humanity in that, and you're feeling real dystopian. But then as it all comes around at the end, and we realize that the gravitational anomalies that we saw from the beginning were actually coming from our main character, and that perhaps it was humanity all along reaching back from the future to save itself from destruction, and that we are perhaps our own salvation, our own agents, that we, through the laws of physics, without having to be supernatural in any way, shape, or form, can become our own salvation. The best of humanity triumphs in the end, and it's all happy. Or that's one interpretation of it. It's not the only one.
And I think I would add that it's not just that humans like become so technologically advanced that we are able to save ourselves, but that there's also this really beautiful poetic element to the narrative where the only way, like there's a moment when Cooper is in the Tesseract and he is working through who they are and how they have this like infinite power to move through space and time, but that they don't, like, given that power, they are unconnected to specific moments in time. And that the reason Cooper has to help these other beings who we can describe as like an advanced human civilization that has now achieved this like great power. Cooper is a human, like, from, I guess it's weird to, I'm now moving back to linear time, but an earlier kind of human. And so he is bound by time and space in a way that the future civilization is not. And so they are using him to connect with Murph in the Tesseract through the bookcase. And it is the bond that they have as family that is really, I think, not just Murph and Cooper's bond, but also the other bonds that the characters in the film create with one another that allows the characters to have the will almost to like progress through the story and to do things that they maybe would not have otherwise had the motivation to do. And so I think the poetic part of the story is, you know, it's about love, and love will set us free. But I think
Love
like
conquers all.
It's, you know, it sounds really cheesy to like say it that way, but it's actually a really central part of Nolan's
true.
Telling of the story.
And about how your limitations could potentially be your unique strengths.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Adam, you look like you have been chomping at something.
No.
Every time you lean forward, I think you're about to say something.
No, I'm not. I mean, I will say
Would you
something,
like
but
to say
something?
I mean, this is no Pan's Labyrinth, right? But you know,
no, it's definitely not a Pan's Labyrinth. That's
I
for
mean,
sure.
it's better, but that's okay.
Man, just hating on magical realism.
There's just less reading.
No,
that's really it. No, so I have to say I will confess I don't like apocalypticism at all, like ever. It's like my least favorite part of studying religion, hands down. And I don't know why per se. Like, I feel like that's surprising. I should like it. And I
wouldn't
don't.
Would you describe yourself as more pessimistic or optimistic? We've talked about the continuum that we seem to have amongst the five of us.
I'm sorry, have you met him?
I know. That's why I'm trying to figure it out.
I think he would call himself a realist, and
I'd refuse your binary. I definitely, I would definitely put myself on the pessimistic end of the range, 100%. And I appreciate there is a certain strain of pessimism in apocalypticism.
Okay.
But, right, I think Zach's probably on target, right? Like, it's not a realist pessimism. And that is more interesting to me, right? So, like, the apocalypticism is like really good fiction from that time, particularly like Second Temple apocalypticism, right? Like, you know, I mean, there are a whole bunch of apocalypses that go way outside of Judaism and Christianity from that period of time. It's just a really popular genre of writing.
mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, no matter how you sort of frame it, it feels escapist to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the part that I just can't ever get behind.
Agreed.
So while I know that that's not the intention in much apocalyptic literature, I don't think it has the effect that it seeks to create. And I find it really problematic.
Well, it comes out of a period of time.
Kendra's like, ah.
Well, I just want you to say more about what's escapist about it. Because I think that there's a fine line between something being escapist versus something, and this would be how I would describe at least Interstellar, is that what the solution to the problem is to leave what can no longer sustain. So they are like literally escaping their current situation. But I think that there's still a lot of weight and like an emphasis on what is lost, or like the risk of having to make decisions to work towards a solution. Whereas for me, I think of escapist stories as maybe making light of what's at stake, or like what is being risked when you leave something.
Okay, so everybody has loved Interstellar so far.
Yeah, we do. So
per
justify yourself.
My usual
Yes.
feeling, right? Here, let me offer you an alternative reading of Interstellar.
Yeah, go ahead and try, Adam.
Okay.
Yeah. Bring it on.
Right. So, as much as Interstellar is very careful about astrophysics, it's not so careful about describing planetary destruction. So, while the science is great on how we escape, it's not particularly great about describing the very slow process of planetary death. I think one could argue that a technological salvation being offered is awfully escapist. That a realist attitude towards a planetary blight is one that focuses resources on dealing with said blight, and that the effort and energy of the film directing us towards making us start anew someplace else is inherently escapist.
Yeah, but then you wouldn't be able to call it Interstellar.
Also true. You'd call it Planet Bound.
There you go. That's the first knock on your argument.
But I think the piece that I would want to push, right, is that the interstellar travel piece probably wouldn't work. And there's a little part of me that reads Interstellar as giving people hope for a technological salvation from potential climate problems that people shouldn't have. I mean, I don't think that's the film's intention, and yet I still think it's like a reading that comes from it.
But Kip Thorne says it could work.
Yeah.
Well, but the the rest of the world was trying to solve the problem on the Earth. It was just this secret NASA project that wasn't like the world's energies were going into this project. It was like a handful of former NASA scientists were holed up in this bunker.
Right, but this is the apocalyptic piece, right? The apocalyptic piece doesn't tell the story of the rest of the world. That's the story I want to hear. But
They
Apocalypse
died.
doesn't. But that's why I want to hear that story. But Apocalypse tells the story of the escape, right? It doesn't tell that story of the people who are behind. They are the ancillary character, the background against which the story gets told. That's the part that just is always more inherently interesting to me.
So I would say that the story that you are talking about is a story that comes from a place of privilege, and that
Nice.
apocalypticism, we're all a little bit privileged. So the story of apocalypticism always comes from oppressed groups. It's never the Romans that are telling stories of apocalypticism. It's always
not true. There are Roman apocalyptics.
No, not during that time period.
Oh, here we go. Fight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a popular literary genre.
Coming from the top, I've never read a Roman apocalyptic before.
Challenge accepted.
All right, go for it. Figure it out, because I'm ready to be wrong.
Yeah, I wasn't wrong. At least I don't think I was. Whatever. It's been a month since we recorded this, and there's still no evidence that I've found of non-Christian Roman apocalyptic literature. I mean, sure, they love stories about people dying in large numbers, but none of the powerful nations in that time period had any real interest in the ending of the age. I mean, why would they? That age was pretty kind to them. But hey, I'm still willing to be wrong, so feel free to let me know about any good Greco-Roman apocalypses that I could sink my teeth into. Sure could use some light pandemic reading in these times.
Keep talking.
So they come out of civilizations and societies, but rarely when they're at their peak. They usually come when they have, as a people, felt such existential dread that they have no hope left in conventional ways of solving things. I think, though, in America, the return to apocalypticism happened after the wars. And after we realized that science gave us the atomic bomb instead of universal food and happy miracle pills that make everyone healthy. And they are most popular among oppressed groups, just in general. And I'm going to stick to that until you prove me wrong. I'm willing to be wrong, and I'm willing to not cut this out of the podcast if I am wrong. But that has been my experience in my study, is that when they are in a position of power, people tend to want incremental bureaucratic change. When people are in a place of trauma and oppression, they are looking outside for some grand hope because they've lost hope in the system.
But I don't buy that.
Here we go.
I'm not arguing for incremental change. I think that's the piece that I would press back against, right? So, and here's where I would want to draw a distinction, right? What you have described to me is prophetic critique, not apocalypse, right? The call for an absurdist, and I use that term sort of technically and intentionally, right? The call for an absurdist vision of hope in the face of existential dread, that I can get behind. I'm okay with that. That makes a lot of sense. I don't think that's what apocalypse does.
Really? What do you think it does?
I am never real sure what it's trying to do.
Placates the masses?
Yes, basically, is what I would argue. I think if I really were pressed about trying to articulate what I think apocalypse does, I think it makes people feel good.
See, and I would put this movie, I'd put all of the young adult fiction that's coming out now, the Hunger Games and that kind of dystopian nightmares that they all seem to want, in that same category, where back then it was the constant threat of new empires that were taking over and destroying cultures left and right. And now it's the constant threat of global war, catastrophe, and climate change that, for younger people especially, they don't see a future. And so their fiction is then draped in these absurdist dystopian worlds where nothing makes sense anymore, but in the end people prevail. And that's the kind of the narrative. That's the formula, is things get worse, they get the worst they can be. Some outside force helps people to overcome, and in the end everything works out okay. And it's the cycle that I think we're just using different images now than we used to, but I think we're telling the same story.
It would take some convincing to make me sort of go there.
I wonder if time is the difference then.
That's exactly what I was about to say.
Nobody is using the Hunger Games to justify their policy positions the way that they use the Book of Revelation to, because it's old and old things carry more authority.
Oh, never mind. That's not what I was going to say.
No.
But I was going to. I was actually going to say that I think in me, this is just me trying to still fight against Adam's interpretation of the film. But I
do
think
like
that,
the film. I'm sorry.
It's
better.
It's fine. I just am going to prove you wrong. So the just
so
kidding,
glad I'm
Adam.
not alone.
You can think whatever you want, but
It's just really a lot of fun to watch this.
I think another reason that it just doesn't make sense to me to see this movie as escapist or as trying to placate people with an apocalyptic story is because I think it's easy to interpret this film as being about death or fighting death in a sense, fighting the death of our species. And I say that because I think it's really easy to make almost anything about death. I study death a lot, and I just think about death a lot. And so any film I watch, I can be like, oh yeah, that's about death. But for Interstellar, I think that time is more important than death. And yes, they are connected, definitely. But, and I think even if you watch or read interviews with Christopher Nolan, and even in the story itself, Michael Caine's character, Dr. Brand, says at one point in the film, I'm not afraid of death. What I'm afraid of is time. And I think that the story, and Christopher Nolan loves to play with time in his films. But in Interstellar, it seems that Cooper and all the connections that the characters have, they are, it's not that they're they are sometimes fighting against time, but the arc of the story, I think, is what am I trying to say here? I think I've just lost my train of thought. Dang it. Give me 1 second. It'll come back to me. No. The train has left the station.
So here's what I'll say. I think actually you and I are a lot closer about the interpretation of this film than maybe you would want to give credit for. Because I also think time is actually the central feature of what's going on, right? And not.
Oh, I got what I have to say. Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Okay, just real quick. I think one of the things that I find more hopeful about time as the centerpiece rather than death as the centerpiece is that in time, the story feels like people still have to take more responsibility because we're not thinking about death coming and destroying our species, but time and how do you work, push against time to compress us as a species. And there are so many different ways that happens. And some of the ways I think in the film that we can see even minor means through which Christopher Nolan is exploring the limitations of time, like the bookshelf in the movie that we see over and over again, and obviously plays a really important role in the Tesseract scene. But there is a moment where you can see some of the books spread out on the floor, and those books are telling stories about time. And I can't remember all of the books that are on the floor, but I think one of the books is The Time Machine and 3 or 4 others. But just the fact that time or writing down stories and narratives that we take with us into the future so that we are always building upon the past. And we see that in written accounts, but also in the story itself. Cooper could not have done what he did without the happenings before and after him. I mean, again, I'm switching back and forth between speaking about linear time versus this circular or space-time understanding of time. But things are so interconnected, and I think the peak of the time story is when you realize that there is interconnection and that we are all responsible for each other. And I think that seems a lot more hopeful and collective rather than an apocalyptic story in the way that you've been talking about this, Adam, which is perhaps more about just trying to not die, whether that means individually or, you have your collective interests too, but it's a little easier to forget about the collective responsibility than when time is the centerpiece, because it you can't separate space and time in a space-time grid.
Yeah, no. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think what I would then question, right, is if time becomes the centerpiece of how it is that you interpret this movie, is it still apocalyptic? Or is that not actually the genre that's describing what's going on? And so this is for me where like I would call the movie highly eschatological, but I'm not sure I'd call it apocalyptic if you make time that centerpiece.
Apocalypse means a revealing. It's at the heart of it is not just the eschatological, but it is the coming forth. It is the breaking through of something from the other side that brings a solution to the modern problem that can't be solved by our conventional means. And so I would say that that wormhole that opens up mysteriously, the giving of information through the fourth dimension from Brand, all of that is very apocalyptic in the literal sense of it.
So what strikes me about the Tesseract scene is that the way in which it functions, these open stacks in which every moment of Cooper's life is available. What struck me about that is it's almost the exact description that my own dissertation advisor wrote for what heaven would be like. That if you talk about preserving a notion of linear time within the construct of eternity, heaven looks something like this, potentially. What's fascinating to me about that then is if you make time the centerpiece in that regard in the movie, it's not the sort of deus ex machina structure of an apocalypticism. It's a sense of eternity woven into the fabric of nature itself. That's a vision of the movie that I can get behind as being really, really important. But I think there's this interesting feature of how we interpret and read the movie. Is it about death? Is it about time? Is it about a sort of notion of salvation? Or is it about this almost intraactive quality of the relational moments that Cooper discovers? And that in turn, we each as individuals could also discover, which I think is really brilliant. But I feel like those are almost two different movies by the time you're done. And I don't think they necessarily can be put. I don't know if you can hold both of those together. There's a little part of me that feels like you have to sort of choose one interpretation or the other. And I like mine.
You would. So privileged. This has been episode 36 of the Down the Wormhole podcast. A big thanks to all our supporters on patreon.com/downthewormhole podcast and all you who are still listening to podcasts even without a daily commute. My hope for you is that thinking about ancient apocalyptic anxieties would help you to know that you are actually in really good company. So let's stick together, friends. Also, make sure you check out downthewormhole.com for show notes, links to further reading, and more. Next week, we are finishing up our mini-series with my very first PG-13 movie, Jurassic Park. So hold on to your butts. We're talking dinosaurs, DNA, ethics, and why John Williams is the most powerful man alive. Until then...
I feel like today, time flew. Hey.